In the quiet hills of Virginia, on a cold Christmas Eve in 1847, a story unfolded that was never written in the history books, yet whispered for generations. It is the story of Mary Ellen, a young woman who carried the weight of chains not only on her body but on her very soul. Her life was marked by silence, submission, and pain, until one night when silence broke and her voice was carved into the earth itself. What happened beneath the old oak tree that winter evening would send ripples far beyond her small community and turn her name into something that carried both fear and respect. This is not a tale of miracles or legends. It is a story of flesh and blood, of unbearable cruelty and a desperate act of justice. As the world celebrated joy and family around warm fires, Mary Ellen chose a different path, one that would cost her everything but grant her the only freedom she ever dreamed of, the freedom to fight back. Stay with us until the very end, because what you are about to hear is both shocking and unforgettable. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel, leave a like to support our work, and tell us in the comments what city you're watching from. Now let us step into the shadows of Virginia, where one woman's decision changed everything. Mary Ellen was known on the plantation not because she was loud or defiant, but because she carried herself with a quiet dignity that could not be erased by hardship. She was 20 years old, with strong hands calloused from endless labor in the fields and sharp eyes that noticed details others missed. While many around her bent their heads in silent endurance, Mary Ellen's gaze often lingered longer, questioning, observing, remembering. She worked from dawn until nightfall, moving between the cotton rows, the laundry yard, and the kitchen where she often prepared meals she herself was rarely allowed to eat. Her skills made her valuable. She could sew with precision, cook with instinct, and manage difficult tasks without complaint. Among the other enslaved workers, she was respected for her calm strength. Younger girls often looked to her for comfort, and the older women whispered that she had an old soul, someone born to endure. Yet that respect was born out of shared suffering, not privilege. To the master and his household, Mary Ellen was nothing more than property, a tool to be used, punished, and replaced if necessary. Still, there was something different about her. Despite her position, she managed to hold on to a sense of self. At night, when the quarters were quiet and the fire dimmed, she would hum soft songs from her childhood, tunes carried from her mother before she was taken away. That humming was more than music. It was survival, a reminder that she was still human, that her heart had not been broken completely. But her strength also made her a target. The master noticed her composure, and it irritated him. In his eyes, she did not bow low enough, did not tremble enough, did not show the fear he expected. He saw her quiet pride as insolence, and every time her eyes met his, he felt challenged. For Mary Ellen, this silent battle was constant, to survive without giving away the spark that burned inside her. It was a dangerous line to walk, one that could be the difference between life and death. Others warned her to keep her head down, to never let her thoughts show. But Mary Ellen could not erase herself to please another. She was trapped in a world where respect meant nothing if it did not come with freedom, and every passing day added weight to the burden she carried in her heart. The breaking point in Mary Ellen's life did not arrive suddenly. It built slowly, like water behind a dam, until one night the wall gave way. She had endured beatings before, as every enslaved person on the plantation did, but there was a cruelty in her master that seemed to sharpen whenever his gaze landed on her. He despised the way she carried herself, the quiet pride he could not extinguish. To him, it was insolence, and to prove his power, he set out to strip her of it. On a bitterly cold December evening, just weeks before Christmas, Mary Ellen was forced into the big house after a long day in the fields. The master accused her of stealing a loaf of bread, though everyone knew the bread had been eaten by his own dogs. The truth never mattered. It was a pretext, a performance of dominance. Before the entire household, he struck her across the face, the crack of the blow echoing against the wooden walls. He forced her to her knees, demanding she beg for forgiveness for a crime she had not committed. Mary Ellen's pride held her still. She did not cry, she did not bow her head low enough for his satisfaction. That night, he lashed her until her back burned with open wounds, then locked her in the smokehouse without food or water. Alone in the darkness, the pain of her body was nothing compared to the humiliation. She could taste blood in her mouth, but what cut deepest was the knowledge that no truth, no innocence could protect her. It was then, sitting against the cold wall of the smokehouse, that a seed took root inside her. She whispered no words, made no vow aloud, but the silence around her became the place where her resolve was born. She thought of her mother, taken away when she was a child. She thought of the girls who looked to her for strength, the boys beaten until they could barely stand, the elders who carried scars from decades of cruelty. The injustice was not hers alone, it was carved into every face she saw each morning. From that night on, Mary Ellen's heart hardened. She no longer sang her mother's songs, she saved them inside herself like hidden weapons. Her eyes grew sharper, her mind quieter. She watched every movement of her master, every weakness in his routine. The oak tree in the yard, massive and unyielding, became a silent witness to her growing determination. Beneath its branches, she often stood, staring at the earth as if she could already see a grave waiting to be filled. Mary Ellen had been forced to her knees, but in her heart she rose taller than ever. That night did not break her, it marked her. From then on, her life was not about survival alone. It was about waiting, preparing, and one day reclaiming the dignity that had been stolen from her. After the night in the smokehouse, life on the plantation did not return to its former rhythm. For Mary Ellen, every day became heavier, every humiliation sharper. The master seemed determined to break her spirit completely. He assigned her the hardest tasks, often forcing her to work long hours in both the fields and the kitchen. When others were allowed brief moments of rest, she was kept moving, her back still raw from the lash. Her wounds reopened daily, staining her clothes with blood, yet she was forbidden to tend to them. The other enslaved workers noticed the cruelty, but they could not intervene. They offered her small kindnesses, a sip of water, a scrap of food, a whispered word of encouragement, but they too lived in fear. Every time Mary Ellen returned from a punishment, the younger girls looked at her with wide, frightened eyes, as if wondering how much a person could endure before breaking. To make matters worse, the master brought in a new overseer that winter. He was a man with no patience and even less mercy, hired to enforce discipline with iron and rope. His presence poisoned what little peace the workers had left. He carried a whip that cracked in the air before it ever struck flesh, a sound that made children cry and men grit their teeth in silence. With him watching, the smallest mistake became an excuse for violence. Mary Ellen's defiance, though silent, drew his attention quickly. He disliked the way she held her head high, just as the master did. Together, they found excuses to torment her, accusing her of slowing down in the fields, of burning food in the kitchen, of disrespecting the household. Each punishment was meant to strip away another piece of her, but instead, they carved her resolve deeper. At night, lying on the rough wooden boards of the quarters, Mary Ellen replayed every injustice in her mind. She thought of the overseer's whip, of the master's smirk, of the oak tree outside the house that seemed to stretch its branches like arms wide enough to embrace all their suffering. She began to imagine not just her own revenge, but the possibility of striking back for everyone who had been silenced. The air on the plantation grew thicker with fear as December dragged on. Christmas, a time when the enslaved were often given small reprieves, was approaching, but this year there was no joy in the anticipation. The master planned a grand dinner, a celebration for his wealthy neighbors, while those who labored for him starved and shivered in the cold. The contrast was unbearable. Laughter and music in the big house, hunger and pain in the quarters. Every blow, every insult, every stolen scrap of dignity became fuel for Mary Ellen's determination. She did not speak of her plan yet, but her silence was no longer submission, it was preparation. With each passing day, her hatred sharpened into purpose. She was no longer waiting for life to change. She was preparing to change it herself. Christmas Eve arrived with a bitter chill that cut through the thin clothing of the enslaved workers. The big house was alive with preparation. Fires burned bright, food roasted in the kitchens, and guests were expected to arrive from neighboring plantations. For those in the quarters, however, the day brought only exhaustion. Mary Ellen had been forced to prepare for the feast from before sunrise, her hands raw from scrubbing pots and hauling heavy trays. The smells of roasted meats and baked pies filled the air, a cruel reminder of meals she would never be allowed to taste. As the sun set, the master grew restless. He ordered Mary Ellen to serve at the dinner table, parading her in front of his guests as if she were part of the display. Dressed in a rough, stained dress, she moved quietly among the men and women in fine coats and gowns, their laughter loud and careless. Every time she lowered a plate or filled a glass, she could feel their eyes on her, not as a human being, but as something less, something owned. The moment of humiliation came when one guest, emboldened by drink, made a crude remark about her. The room erupted in laughter, and the master encouraged it, grabbing Mary Ellen by the arm and forcing her to bow before the table as if she were entertainment. His hand dug into her skin, and his voice, dripping with arrogance, declared her a reminder of his wealth and control. The insult was public, deliberate, and unforgettable. Mary Ellen's chest burned with shame, but her eyes stayed steady. She did not cry, did not beg. That more than anything enraged the master. In front of everyone, he struck her across the face, sending her sprawling to the floor. The guests laughed nervously, some shifting uncomfortably, but none dared to intervene. She was ordered out, her dignity stripped bare, her body aching, her heart nearly breaking. When she returned to the quarters, the others gathered around her, their faces filled with fear and pity. But Mary Ellen's silence that night was different. She sat by the small fire, her face swollen, and stared into the flames without blinking. She had endured countless cruelties, but this public humiliation, on a night when families elsewhere celebrated peace and joy, was the final wound. It was no longer about her own suffering. It was about the endless chain of pain they all carried. That night, beneath the cold sky of Virginia, Mary Ellen crossed a threshold she could never return from. The oak tree stood outside, massive and waiting, its roots deep in the earth like secrets buried long ago. In her mind, the image was clear. Her master's laughter silenced, his power cut down, his body consumed by the very soil he had once walked upon so proudly. From that moment, her path was set. Survival was no longer enough. The time for endurance had ended. The time for retribution had begun. The night after her humiliation, Mary Ellen did not sleep. She sat upright on the rough boards of the quarters, her mind racing with images of the master's smirk, the echo of laughter from his guests, and the sting of his hand across her face. Something inside her had shifted forever. By dawn, she was no longer alone in her thoughts. Others had seen, others had suffered, and they too carried wounds that never healed. She began quietly, speaking in whispers while the overseer's back was turned, or in hushed voices by the dying fire. Samuel, an older man with a limp from years of beatings, was the first to listen. He had lost his wife to the master's cruelty and carried grief like a stone in his chest. Then came Ruth, barely 16, who bore scars on her wrists from being tied for hours as punishment. Each of them, when Mary Ellen spoke, nodded slowly, their eyes reflecting the same fire that now burned in hers. One by one, she drew them in. Some hesitated at first, afraid of the risk, but she reminded them that their lives were already claimed, their days already numbered by the whip and the hunger. "We have nothing left but what we take for ourselves," she told them. Her voice was steady, calm, but her words struck deep. By the end of the week, there were 7 of them, each with their own story of loss, each carrying a wound that demanded justice. Together, they began to plan. Mary Ellen insisted it could not be reckless rage, it had to be deliberate, precise. They studied the master's movements, the way he drank deep into the night, how he often left the guests to boast in the parlor while slipping away for fresh air near the oak tree. The overseer, too, had his patterns, drunk and heavy-footed by evening, cruel but careless when his senses dulled. Their meetings were secret, carried out in silence and with signals only they understood. A glance, a gesture, the placement of a tool, everything became part of their language. In the shadows of the quarters, they rehearsed not with weapons but with trust, knowing that hesitation would mean death. The plan was simple in its essence. Strike during the Christmas feast, when the master would be distracted, his guard lowered, and the overseer sluggish with drink. To seal their pact, Mary Ellen led them to the oak tree one moonless night. They stood in a circle, their breath rising in the cold air, their hands joined. She pressed her palm against the rough bark and whispered that the tree, which had witnessed so much pain, would now bear witness to their justice. Each of them repeated the gesture, a silent oath binding them together. From that night forward, the plantation no longer felt like a place of only despair. Beneath the surface, something had shifted. In the quiet glances they shared, in the small nods of understanding, a storm was gathering. They were no longer just survivors. They were conspirators, bound by blood, grief, and the promise of freedom carved into the roots of an ancient oak. The night of Christmas Eve fell heavy and cold over the hills of Virginia. Inside the big house, firelight flickered against the walls, and the air was thick with the smells of roasted meats, cinnamon, and brandy. The master's guests had gathered in their finest attire, laughter echoing as glasses clinked in endless toasts. Outside, the quarters were silent, the enslaved workers huddled against the freezing wind, their stomachs empty while the feast carried on. Mary Ellen and her companions had prepared for this night with painstaking care. Each had their role. Samuel would distract the overseer, Ruth would signal when the master left the table, and the others would be ready near the oak tree. Mary Ellen herself would lead the final act. Her heart pounded, but her face betrayed nothing. She had carried pain for years, and now she carried purpose. As the feast grew louder, the master, drunk with pride and liquor, stepped outside for fresh air. His heavy boots crunched against the frost-covered ground as he wandered toward the oak tree, the very place where Mary Ellen and her allies waited in silence. He muttered to himself, unaware that shadows moved in the dark just beyond the glow of the house lights. The overseer followed minutes later, stumbling with a bottle in hand. Samuel stepped forward, offering a false word about a broken fence by the barn. The overseer cursed, shoved him aside, and staggered into the darkness, straight into the waiting arms of two men who pulled him down before he could cry out. His bottle shattered in the frost, the last sound he made before a hand silenced him forever. Meanwhile, Mary Ellen emerged from the shadows. Her figure stood still and steady beneath the wide branches of the oak. When the master turned, his drunken grin faded into confusion. For the first time, he saw her not as property, not as something beneath him, but as a force standing tall in the night. "You think you can defy me?" he slurred, stepping closer. But she did not answer. She only raised her hand, and from the darkness the others appeared, 7 figures bound by a silent oath. Panic flickered across his face as realization struck too late. They dragged him to the base of the tree, his protests muffled, his arrogance crumbling into fear. For every lash he had given, for every humiliation he had inflicted, their hands worked with unshakable resolve. Mary Ellen did not flinch as the earth was broken open beneath the oak's roots. The soil was cold and hard, but they dug as if they had been waiting their whole lives for this moment. The master struggled, cursed, promised retribution, but Mary Ellen only stared down at him, her eyes steady, her silence louder than any words she could speak. When the last shovel of earth fell, covering his face, the laughter from the big house carried faintly into the night, unaware that its host would never return. Beneath the ancient oak, the ground closed over him, and for the first time, Mary Ellen felt the weight of chains begin to lift. When the last mound of earth was packed down beneath the oak tree, a silence fell over the group. Their breathing came heavy in the cold air, steam rising from their mouths, but no one spoke. The master was gone, swallowed by the ground he had once ruled over. For a long moment, the only sound was the rustling of branches above, as if the tree itself sighed with relief. But Mary Ellen knew their act could not end with one burial. The soil might cover his body, but the scars he had left behind still burned across their skin, across their memories. They needed something more, something that would cleanse the weight of years of suffering, something that would tell every soul still living in chains that the night had changed forever. The overseer's body lay nearby, lifeless and broken. Samuel, his hands trembling, whispered that the man deserved the same grave as his master. The others nodded. Together, they dragged him beneath the roots, laying his corpse beside the man he had served so faithfully in cruelty. For once, the two were equal, stripped of titles, stripped of power, swallowed by the same dirt they had forced others to till. When it was done, Mary Ellen lit a torch. The flame sputtered in the icy wind but caught strong, glowing against her face. She turned toward the storage shed near the barn, where whips, chains, and iron shackles were kept. Without a word, she walked forward and the others followed. They piled the tools of their bondage into a heap, leather straps, collars, ropes, the instruments of endless humiliation. With a single motion, she set the torch to it. The fire roared to life, devouring the symbols of their suffering. Sparks leapt into the night sky, and the smell of burning leather filled the air. For those who watched, it was more than destruction, it was purification. The flames reflected in their eyes, each crackle a reminder that the old order was gone, if only for this night. The fire's glow spread across the yard, and though music and laughter still echoed faintly from the big house, the enslaved in the quarters began to stir, drawn out by the light. One by one, men, women, and children emerged, watching the fire with awe. Some whispered prayers, some wept silently, and some simply stood, their faces bathed in orange glow. They did not yet know the details of what had been done, but they understood its meaning. The chains that had bound them were burning. Mary Ellen stood before the fire, her figure strong against the inferno. For the first time, she felt not just her own dignity return, but a collective power rising among them. The oak tree behind her loomed tall, guarding its secret, while the flames cleansed the ground before it. That night, under the stars of Christmas Eve, the plantation was transformed. Fear had not vanished, but it was no longer unchallenged. Something greater had taken root, the fire of resistance, born from soil, blood, and flame. The fire burned late into the night, and by dawn, only glowing embers remained. The enslaved who had gathered around it whispered among themselves, voices low and urgent. They knew something irreversible had happened, even if they hadn't seen it with their own eyes. The master's absence was undeniable. His booming orders, his cruel laughter, the sharp crack of his commands, all of it had vanished into silence. At first, disbelief clung to them. Could it be true? Could a man who had ruled over them with iron and blood simply be gone? But when the overseer failed to appear as well, fear gave way to a dangerous flicker of hope. Children, sensing a change in the air, played more freely that morning. The women, usually stiff with caution, allowed themselves quiet conversations by the fire. The men looked at each other with eyes that held questions they dared not voice aloud. Mary Ellen and her small circle carried themselves differently now. They did not boast, did not speak of what they had done, but their silence was a shield and their presence a declaration. Those who had suffered most felt it first. The invisible weight on their shoulders had lifted, if only slightly. For the first time, they looked toward the oak tree not with dread, but with reverence. It stood as a monument to justice, rooted in soil that now held the bones of tyranny. Word began to spread beyond the quarters. On nearby plantations, whispers carried in the night. A master in Virginia had vanished, swallowed by the earth itself, taken by those he once commanded. The story twisted and grew, as stories often do. Some said he was dragged down by spirits of the enslaved, others that the tree itself had risen to claim him. But among the enslaved, one truth remained steady. Mary Ellen had struck back, and in doing so, she had shown that defiance was possible. With hope, however, came danger. By the second day, neighboring landowners grew suspicious. They sent riders to investigate, demanding answers. The absence of both master and overseer raised alarms, and when no clear explanation was given, fear turned to fury. The system that kept them in power could not allow such a mystery to stand. Patrols began scouring the woods, armed men rode the roads, and the quarters were watched more closely than ever before. The enslaved understood the risk. Reprisals would be swift if suspicion turned toward them. Yet even under this shadow, something had shifted forever. Stories of Mary Ellen spread like sparks on dry grass. She was no longer just a young woman who had endured humiliation. She was becoming a symbol. For those who had no weapons, her act became one. For those who had lost all hope, her name became a reminder that chains could be broken. The balance of fear had tilted. Though danger loomed greater than ever, so too did the sense that resistance was not only possible, it had already begun. The days after the master's disappearance were filled with unease. Armed riders came and went, searching the plantation grounds, interrogating the enslaved, and scouring the woods. They demanded answers, but no one spoke. Fear tightened every throat, yet behind lowered eyes a quiet unity held firm. The truth of that night beneath the oak tree was a secret bound tighter than chains. But secrets rarely remain buried forever. Within a week, suspicion hardened into accusation. The absence of both master and overseer could not be explained by chance. Rumors pointed to Mary Ellen, whose steady gaze and unbroken silence marked her as different. The landowners needed a scapegoat, and she became the target. Soldiers were sent, their boots pounding against the frozen earth as they stormed the quarters. Mary Ellen did not run. She stood tall as they dragged her away, her wrists bound in rope, her face steady against the jeers and threats. The others watched in silence, their hearts breaking but their pride swelling too. She was taken to the center of the town, paraded as a warning to anyone who might dare follow her path. The authorities declared her guilty without trial, her crime spoken aloud as defiance. On the morning of her execution, the sky hung gray and heavy, the air biting with winter chill. Crowds gathered, some curious, others eager for blood. Yet Mary Ellen walked without fear. She looked not at her captors, but at the faces of those who stood quietly at the edges, men and women whose eyes glistened with tears, children clinging to their mothers. For them, she carried herself with dignity until the very end. Her final words were simple, spoken with a voice that did not tremble. "You can take my body, but not my name. My name will live." And it did. That night, whispers spread faster than the patrols could silence them. In the quarters of plantations across Virginia, the story grew. Mary Ellen had buried her master alive beneath the oak tree, had lit the fire that consumed the tools of bondage, had walked to her death unbroken. Some said the tree still carried her spirit, its roots entwined with justice, its branches stretching to shield the oppressed. Others swore that when the wind moved through its leaves, they could hear her voice humming the songs she once sang in the dark. Mary Ellen's body was gone, but her memory became immortal. She was no longer just a young woman enslaved in Virginia. She became a legend, a symbol of courage and defiance. For generations, her story was passed in whispers, carried from one fire to another, a reminder that even in the darkest of nights, resistance could bloom. The oak tree still stands. Beneath its roots lies not only the body of a man who thought himself untouchable, but the unshakable truth that dignity cannot be buried. Mary Ellen's name endures, her act echoing through time, a testament that freedom is never granted, it is taken.